Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. Although today we're mixing more, I guess we should say, local cocktails because we'll be talking very much about Windham County. And I want to welcome to the show regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Olga. Good morning.
Good morning. And sorry, folks, I'm a little distracted. I'm at my friend's house and it's a very echoey room, so I can hear myself. It's very strange. I also want to welcome Lachlan Francis, who's the chair of the Windham County Democratic Party. So glad you can join us today, Lachlan.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
We are taking a little break from talking about healthcare here on the happy hour because with the election coming up, Emily and I were talking the other day about, I was feeling very bad that there's a number of candidates I haven't reached out to yet, especially those in the Republican Party. It's not you, it's me being disorganized. I apologize for that. But Emily happened to mention, like, how do we even talk about elections besides beyond the horse race? How can they really actually mean something when we talk about elections so that people can make decisions? And you asked an interesting question, Emily, about how do you talk to voters in a very blue county, I think is kind of how you put it.
And it's what do I do as a candidate, I think. And I tend to sort of go through the motions of a competitive race, whether the race is competitive or not. Because I think that for the most part, for me, the point of campaign season is to just hear from voters, and I'll need that to represent them regardless. But I think voters are very confused about what to do. And that's sort of what I want to talk about for the bulk of today. Um, and I think I'm a little tired of hot takes. And I think most of the hot takes are about just like whether a voter is going to come down here or there. There's, I'm curious to think about just sort of how voters navigate election season in a county where most of the races are already sort of decided and assumed. And so we don't get attention from statewide candidates very much. We certainly don't get attention from national candidates. And there's still like a lot of political people here. And so like I'm just want to sort of talk about like how we engage with them, how we think they engage with the world.
Lachlan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, one thing that came right to mind when Emily, said that, and it's certainly my experience too, that right, the vast there's a decent number of towns that have somewhat competitive elections maybe this year in Windham County, but they are disproportionately the towns with less than 1,000 residents, or certainly less than 2 or 3 thousand. I mean, the you know, population centers in Windham County certainly are in pretty safe districts. But I also think, in terms of the change here, we are a little bit, I think, victims of the success of independents like Laura Sibilia and Kelly Piala up in Londonderry. Like when I was younger in this role, that Wardsboro district used to flip back and forth every 2 years. And that was like a big part of the reason the county Democrats existed was to go invade Wardsboro every other November or whatever. And Laura has held that seat for 8 years or 10 years now or something, and that sort of settled into more of a stasis. That really was like right when I was younger, that was always competitive. That was always a really close election. And we literally, there's not a single district house or senate like that in Windham County anymore.
Mm.
And it hasn't been that way certainly in this decade, in the 2020s. I mean, 2018, we saw sort of the last, sort of flips, if you will, like places like Guilford and Vernon. I would be surprised if they flipped back at least, anytime in the near future. But right, it's become less competitive in the last 10 to 15 years for sure.
And just for listeners who might be new to the area, um, Guilford Vernon for a long time was held by Republicans. And then when Sarah Coffey was elected, right? When Mike Hebert
Yeah,
stepped down, um, she was elected and she was the first Dem in several cycles to have been elected for Vernon Guilford.
yeah.
Can we back up a little bit? Like what I think people have, like, if you pay attention to just national politics, which is most people who pay attention to politics do, you might have a sense of like what a political party is for and a political party does that has like really nothing to do with Vermont's capacity, I'll say. And so I wonder if we could like back up a little bit and talk about the mechanisms of party politics. Um,
Totally.
Sorry, before you jump
yeah,
in, Lachlan, when you talk about Vermont's capacity,
yeah.
Emily, what do you mean?
Like we don't, there are only like I think people think about politics as like the political machine, and the political machine sort of like shapes the candidates and shapes how the candidates behave, and it's like a um, thing that candidates have to get through is like navigating the party and like they're
Yeah.
answerable to the party and all of those things, and like
Not in this state.
none of that's true here. And they like provide resources for candidates, even also not really true here. And so I think like that, even just like understanding like how many people and what the party looks like, I think might be helpful for folks because I think people still have assumptions that it is something, something
Mhm.
tangible.
Yeah, and I'll split this into two categories. I think okay, so like for starters in right, in my sort of like day job, work in other states a lot in politics, and like right, in New York, there very much is still a machine. Now, in New York, they'd be having the same conversation of, oh my God, the machine's less powerful than it used to be. It's still infinitely more powerful than anything that exists in Vermont. Um, but yes, that is right now, like there is not I mean, in politics, for better and for worse, mostly just for worse. But all things cost money, right? Staff costs money, advertising costs money, organizing costs money. Um, and the state Democratic Party has not, been well funded in a long time because again, we haven't had a competitive election for governor since 2016 was the last time it was like in single digits, and it might not have even been single digits that year, but it was
Mhm.
at least close. And so the money has not materialized, and there's real effects as that goes, as you get smaller and smaller to your small, to your communities, to your town committees, to your county committees. Like, yes, there is some level of from the grassroots up, and that's important. But to get people wanting to come in the door and be involved, you also have to have, some infrastructure for them to plug into. And the reality of where Vermont is as a state in the like national landscape of competitive elections, the type of people who would make the investments to make that happen have deemed that we're not worth it. And frankly, like a lot of the big donor types in Vermont have similarly said that they'd rather like, send their money to flipping the House from Republican to Democratic control. Or that maybe for some donor folks that they're not that upset with the current political stasis in Vermont, and maybe they don't want to rock that apple cart. So there's a lot of challenges there. I would say, right, to Emily's point, like, I'll start locally. Like the town and Democratic committees do not have, any special position of power or influence for the most part. Like in New York, for example, they get to help decide who the judges are in every
Mhm.
county. Which helps you raise a lot of money from the legal profession and keep a lot of trains moving. And then we
So
don't, oh, go
what,
ahead.
so like, can we just describe like how many people are on a town committee and what, like how many people are on the county committee and like what does it
Yeah.
actually do?
I mean, a town committee is literally just any three people who are willing to sign a piece of paper that tells the state that on that morning they woke up and felt like a Democrat. And you can be a town committee if you've got three people who all come to that same conclusion on the same day at the same time, so long as the meeting was publicly warned. So a town committee is just three people who say that they want to be a member of a party. And really, at the town committee level, your only role is to nominate justices of the peace. It can be if you live in we don't have any of these in Windham County, but if you live in a city like Barry or Rutland or Burlington, it gets a little bit more complicated because then you've got like partisan nominations for mayor and city council and stuff like that. But if you're not in one of the 8 incorporated cities, it's pretty much just justices of the peace and then whatever else you would like to do. Now, I will say in other parts of the state that have really competitive legislative districts, usually those town committees are a bit more active and folks sort of understand that part of why that town committee exists is to help their state rep candidate or state senate candidate win their town. But again, to Emily's earlier point, people in Windham County don't really have that notion a lot because we don't see competitive elections for state house or for state senate in this county. Then building up to the county committee, it depends on the size of your town committee, but each town gets between 1 and a dozen. Like I think Brattleboro in the Windham County example gets a dozen, and I'm from Westminster, we get 3 or 4 delegates to the county committee. And those county committees, typically in rural Vermont, the town committees have not done much outside of the Justice of the Peace stuff and have sort of passed folks off to the county committee. And then the county committee is sort of, in touch with the state and able to say like, oh, Mike Pichek's coming to town in 2 weeks, here's the information for his event if you'd like to go, right? And so that is a typical model in rural Vermont. I would say it's very different, like up in Chittenden County, there's times when like the Burlington City Party is like the whole show in town, if it's a mayoral election or something like that. So that's a little bit about, how the structures work. But to Emily's point, like there's not, in other states and in big counties, like the county parties will like run expensive voter contact programs, like running television ads or doing direct mail or radio, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. And that could not be farther from the landscape we're operating at in Vermont. I think this year is, at least in modern memory, the most money we've ever raised. And we raised like $5,000 and we're going to send, we've sent some money out to candidates. We can do some events with it. Like, we'll spend it, but it's like, it is not a profound amount of money. That's for sure.
And so like the people who are involved in the county party, there's probably like, 10 to 20 people from around the whole county who engage regularly. And then Lachlan's the volunteer chair who essentially staffs an office sometimes when he can on the other side of his day job, right? That's the big machine operation in Windham County.
And I would say in the spectrum of county committees, there are 14 of us. We're probably in the top, certainly in the top like 4 in terms of like doing stuff. And we're not, I wouldn't say we're doing a ton, But I think a lot of that, I will say, like, this is all true right now, but it's all different when the governor is a Republican, right? Like, it really does go in both directions because like money is the lubricant of all this, right? And there's no professional staffing south of Route 4 in Democratic politics in Vermont. It does not exist. Not a single person. So, and that will only change when there's a Democratic governor, because part of being the Democratic governor is, the Democratic Governors Association and other entities come in and say, have you raised $1 million for your state party yet? Well, what are you doing? How much help do you need to get there? And so there was a time when the state party was well resourced and in a manner that allowed us to invest statewide. And, that time coincided with having a Democratic governor who had a large incentive to raise money into the state party and maintain a network. And then the second that went away, the state party's ability to fundraise went away. And, that's unfortunate. It's not a huge surprise, but but we are feeling that. And
So,
also, like even for the ground, like from the ground up too. It's not all my, but it's also from, it's a lot easier and more exciting to get people to come to like, because with all due respect to the federal delegation, like they're great, but they tend to have the same comments all the time, and it's like pretty generic. And in Vermont, just about everyone's on the same side of the same issues. It's like if you hate ISIS and love abortion, or it's like there's a lot of two thumbs up issues that you could talk about as a member of the federal delegation. But it was easier, I think, to get people to come to like something with the governor where everyone's got a complaint about city government, and everyone's got something that they want to share or say. And so that there was just a little more like enthusiasm and all that too.
mhm. Well,
So that
that
I'm hopeful
raises
that'll work too.
a question for me, Lachlan. What you were mentioning about um, fundraising when we don't have a Democratic governor, or a governor who's a Dem. Um, I would think the party would want to fundraise more and try to flip.
You would, wouldn't you?
Yeah. So I'm not asking a stupid question then. um, is there thought behind why that hasn't happened? Um,
I have lots of thoughts. The question I would ask is how many hours a week are party leaders putting in on the phones begging rich people for money? Because
mhm.
that's
It's
no one, like, it sucks. It's the worst part of politics, but that's what brings in the bacon. And we used to have a party leader who spent many hours every week doing that, and we haven't for 8 years.
It's and sort of two things. One, to be clear, it's not as if like, there is a Republican governor, and it's not as if the county Republican Party is a like political machine flush with cash either.
True, true.
And so I think that's sort of an interesting thing to talk about. When there's someone at the top of the ticket that people that has a lot of experience in politics and a really broad political network, that for better or for worse, and this is not how I want politics to work, it is like profoundly, charismatic person based. Um, and so having that charismatic person at the top being the person that people are asking for money for, who like has that existing network, so people know them already and trust them already, before they give, is a lot of sort of what drives the party. And I think that's the piece that surprised me the most since I started doing this, is that the politicians in Vermont are who sort of carry the party rather than the party carrying the politicians.
Mm.
100%. But I would really like charisma is part of it, but you know, the best money mover in my time in professional politics has been the least charismatic person, and Mitch McConnell. The thing I give infinite respect to Mitch for is that dude wakes up at 5:30 in the morning and works till midnight, and he's literally just demanding what he needs from everybody he comes across for 17 or 18 hours. And that's a lot. Like I can't do that with my life. I don't, but like there is nothing close to that sort of effort that exists in Vermont politics when it comes to like raising money and building infrastructure.
Mhm.
There hasn't been for a long time. Um, I don't expect it to change anytime in the immediate future, but like in terms of making those asks and raising the money and making the investments, like people in Vermont, it's funny how far we've moved. Like the going rate, most folks would say to win, back in 2016, the conventional wisdom to win a primary back then was $1 million starting price. Primary alone, 1.5 more, at least in the general. So you're talking like raising $2.5 million in the cycle as a bare minimum 8 years ago. It's probably 4.5 now. We're not going to have anyone who raises more than 10% of that this cycle. And part of that's because those races aren't happening. But also, like, honestly, I don't know how many candidates are spending 20 or 30 hours a week doing call time, and it's horrible. I've staffed a lot of it. Like, it's soul sucking, but it's no, I wouldn't say you can't do retail politics or can't go meet voters. It's just that you got to work 75 hours a week and spend 40 meeting people and 35 raising money. And we don't have that in Vermont right now. And so we don't have the resources that are commensurate with it.
Mhm.
And I want to highlight like money. I understand that people don't want money to drive politics. I don't want money to drive politics. It's not that like money buys votes. And in Vermont, like people get sort of annoyed by too much direct mail. So like money can buy direct mail, all those things. But what money also buys is infrastructure of humans to answer the phone when a volunteer calls or
Mm.
someone who has the time, like to really run a meaningful volunteer effort, you need multiple full-time staff training people,
Yeah.
buying seltzer, like motivating people, working spreadsheets, making sure that like six people don't show up in the same place at the same time, people are safe, like volunteer capacity. And I think this is true throughout Vermont, regardless of politics, is not something that just happens because people want to volunteer. Like there needs to be a system for people to volunteer into. And I think that's what like really meaningful money can buy if like state infrastructure to build out state infrastructure for whichever party
Yeah.
is
And I'm
working.
really glad you said that because I work around this stuff. So like the money part is pretty cut and dry for me. Of course, people should be upset about money in politics, but what I'd say about why this is so important is when we have this period of like stasis and um sort of ambivalence around that infrastructure stuff, what we are empowering is the out of state single source PAC money because that one person or one interest group, like we're seeing it with the Koch brothers right now, Americans for Prosperity, and some of the misinformation they're spreading in Vermont, like they can just come in and spend $250,000. They're not like they could lose that money in the couch cushions and they don't care. And that's one person's $250,000. In Vermont, like what we're just talking about of candidates putting in the hours and raising money through party committees are limited. You can raise, for a statewide candidate, $4,000 per candidate, $10,000 to the party, $1,000 for state house, right? You're adding, and it's not just in Vermont because the limits are like you can get on a call time list, making like a $200 donation, which in New York would never happen. You'd have to add two zeros to that at least. But what is important about that is that is like accountable hard side money. We know every single person who gives. We know their occupation and employer. We have full like that's the kind of I would say like that's the kind of money in politics we should like be encouraging of those hard side dollars where it is disclosed. It is all everyone knows what's going on. And that's the type of stuff that makes those investments Emily was just talking about in organizing capacity, in being able to have like actually, effective talking points that you can give to your volunteers about when you're communicating about property taxes. Here's how I'd recommend you do it. And we know this is good advice because here's the research that demonstrates it's the right thing to alleviate X, like there's all that sort of infrastructural work that by and large, can't happen under a budget of again, like honestly, I mean, if you just think about it, like the Vermont Democratic Party, and I'm very proud of this fact, but that they are all, it's a union, union contract, union negotiated workplace. So by the time you have an executive director and like five or six staff, which to run a statewide political party is not that much, and then some operating costs, I mean, you're very quickly looking at $750,000 annual budget for that, right? And if the money hasn't been there in the last few election cycles to sustain that, I think that's unfortunate. It's no fault of the people, running the show over there. It's sort of a reality of the things we've talked about in terms of like, right, who's going to help them raise the money or why would, you know, again, so much of our particular problem is that a lot of the people who could be cutting a $10,000 check, like Phil Scott, so why would they give $10,000 to get rid of him? But we're not bringing that in, and so some of the, I would say, down the list work just doesn't happen. But to Emily's point, it's not like the Republicans are doing it either, because Phil Scott like does not really raise money into the Republican Party either. He just kind of keeps it himself and for the most part ignores them. So that's starting to change a little bit this year, but we'll see.
So I have some questions about what you said, Lachlan, about PAC money, but we're just about out of time here, so I'm going to save that for the second half. Um, but Emily, given that you kind of started this conversation off with some questions, um, what are you sitting with right now? What do you think is still key for people to understand?
Well, in the second half, I just love to talk about sort of like, so what do voters do in Windham County? What do people who want to get involved in politics do with their time in order to feel useful? And what do people do with their time that isn't that useful, but maybe keeps them feeling excited, engaged, and motivated, right? Those might be two different things, and that's okay. And so would love to talk about that after the break.
Okay, fantastic. So we're going to take a quick break here on the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. And we will be right back with Emily Kornheiser and Lachlan Francis from the Windham County Democratic Party. So stay tuned, folks. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro, and Lachlan Francis, who is the volunteer chair of the Windham County Democratic Party. So glad you can be both here. I know, Emily, you had some questions you wanted to talk about, but I would just like a little clarity. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I?
You are.
I totally am. The coffee is kicking in. So I have to pause here and thank BCTV for taking the video version of this show and sharing it with stations around Vermont and some other places in New England as well. And Emily, what do we need to remind listeners of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests, respectively, not the station, nor platform, family, friends, employers of the people speaking.
Did you get that, Francis? So we have been talking about the political machine in Vermont, which sounds like we don't have one compared to other states. But one thing you talked about, Francis, in the first half of the show that I want to revisit, I'd like to dig into a little bit, is you were talking about fundraising in Vermont and how it's not really happening for either the Republicans or the Democratic parties. But it sounded like, if I heard you correctly, um, that the lack of fundraising, organization, strong party infrastructure leaves sort of a vacuum and allows maybe some of the national PACs more leeway in the state. Did I hear you correctly on that? I'd like to revisit that.
Totally. Yeah, and I mean, they don't always decide they care, right? Like they have to have sort of a business interest, and even if their business is just politics, like the RGA, to their credit, which is the Republican Governors Association, I actually like have to sort of tip my cap to their work because the first thing they say is like, your record on abortion, couldn't care less. Your record of winning elections, all that matters. Like they are not necessarily, I mean, obviously, you look at other states, they're uplifting like the worst of the worst Republicans, right? But they are an equal opportunity spender. They just want to win, right? And so that's one type of spender. Your other might be, like a more issue-based PAC, or like I mentioned earlier, the Koch brothers, the Americans for Prosperity, they're doing, work specifically to boost like fuel dealers, right? So that's a little bit more of a business interest. But right, when it's not that like these out of state or special interest money groups do it every year or like are always doing it. That's definitely not the case. I mean, like the reality is most Vermont, we could like ban the making of money in Vermont and none of them would ever notice the difference in terms of their bottom lines. But when they do decide to come to town, the fact that there is not much of a robust, like hard-sided programming going on means that they can sort of like walk in and be the only game in town or one of the only in town. I mean, right now, I believe Phil Scott and John Rogers are doing a combined television buy of $57,000. And that is the only television advertising buy that has happened for a statewide election in Vermont this election cycle.
Hmm.
I would say like all 49 other states, even you take out the rich, like the Californias and the New Yorks, they're like prohibitively expensive. The bare minimum almost probably anywhere else for a governor's race is like $1 million on TV. And we have the cheapest TV markets in America, like by far. Burlington only costs $41 a point. Like it literally in New Hampshire, you cross the river into New Hampshire and it's over $300. So New Hampshire is 10 times, almost 10 times more expensive than us. And yet we don't see money on TV. So if a special interest group, and so far it hasn't happened, but like, let's say someone, there's a race for lieutenant governor this year, the blue team, if you will, between David Zuckerman for lieutenant governor and then whatever, special interest groups or super PACs on our side, like all that, are spending nothing on TV. Rogers and Phil are splitting this $57,000 buy. I don't know what they will do, but like, right, some Republican group, if they decided to, could just walk in and throw $500,000 at it, and that would be nothing for them.
Mhm.
And that would be 10 times more than what all hard side, just trackable, accountable dollars in Vermont are spending. So we don't really run campaigns as any other state would see them. Doesn't happen in Vermont. And that is okay in some regards, but like when those special interests decide they want to come to town, the thing is we just hand the whole town to them. Like they're the only.
So,
And so
in other words,
practically-
that's the only voice the voters are hearing.
Yeah.
They're not
Yeah, and
hearing any
right now,
counter.
to be fair, they're not. But like, if I was professionally advising one of those groups and on the other side of the aisle, I'd say like, why not? They're not doing anything. What's the worst that could happen? Like they set $1 million on fire like a day in Arizona and like whatever, why not spread the fire around? So right, because we don't have sort of self-sufficient politics, we make ourselves easier to be invaded in that way.
And so practically it's that there's an information vacuum, basically,
Yes.
and so there's no baseline quantity of information that is being communicated broadly to the public on a regular basis from any party, really, or any politician. And so anything that does show up sort of spreads very quickly and has no counterpoints to it.
Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you for diving back into that. I think that is an important thing for people to understand
Totally.
about what they're hearing during an election.
Yeah.
Emily, you were wondering about how to engage voters,
Yeah.
especially in a county where maybe it's not necessarily needed for the immediate elections.
People, in my experience, for the most part, tend to not get engaged unless like their team is losing or might not have a strong chance of winning. Like that, it like becomes, I think I've said on the show before, like I never played team sports. I don't really understand them. I don't understand what happens in people's brains that motivates them towards them. It's just like, I just don't get it. But that is sort of like what gets people out the door, even to just like attend forums to learn more, tends to happen when something is at risk, right? That's when people engage. And so like in Windham County, that's not like post-primary, that's not true, really. A little bit sort of in the north of the county, a little bit in the west of the county, but generally not true. And so people are, though, very, very engaged about the presidential race. Of course. And so like what do people do with regards to like the party infrastructure here or not around the presidential race? So, the state of America right now is that people are scared to talk to each other because social media is a toxic nightmare and it makes people think that that's what humans are like rather than that that's what humans inside their computer are like, which are two different things. And so they're scared. So people are scared to talk to each other. And so people want to put up lawn signs and they want to donate.
Yeah.
And
And
so folks donate and like that's great. And like most people who are donating are not like making a big impact on the Harris campaign, right? And then people want to put up lawn signs in Vermont and like in Brattleboro, and it's like sort of sweet and cheerful to see them when I'm driving around. But like even in the most competitive of circumstances, lawn signs actually don't make any difference in an election. And certainly here, they make no difference. And so then the question is like, well, so what do people do if they care? And people are responding in such an interesting variety of ways. And given how like sort of disparate the internet, like the ecosystem of politics is at this point, it's fun to see like some people, and Lachlan can talk sort of more about what the party is actually doing in Vermont to support out of state races. But, I have friends who like have found an organization called Seed the Vote, and they're like going to Wisconsin for a week. They're going to Philadelphia for a week. Almost everyone I talk to has some like very complex postcard writing project that they're doing for some random organization they found in some other state. And it's so interesting to me, like, how do people find those postcard things? And when I ask them, they're like, I don't know. I, heard about it from a friend. And so it's interesting to figure out
my
like how
mom
this
makes soup. My mom's one of the soup women, who like it's
yeah.
awesome. They sell thousands of dollars worth of soup. It's amazing.
Tell us about the soup, Lachlan. People
Yes,
might not
please.
Well, the sister district, I can't remember all the details, but they make soup at home. Like they mass produce soup. They all get sent the recipe and everyone goes home and mass produces this soup and then they sell a bunch of it. I think a lot of people like buy big quantities that just gets brought to the food shelf or something. But
Mhm.
all the money that gets raised in that then goes through the sister district project and then gets sent to candidates in legislative districts in swing states. Like I think this year, I can't remember her name, but the candidate who Southern Vermont sister district is working with is a woman running for state senate in Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
So right, Emily's point was great. I would say if comparing when I was first getting involved locally, it was in the 2012 election cycle, and things were so different. Things were centralized, right? Your county party really was locally probably your best way to get in touch with, like how to do something for Barack Obama, right? Even if all the county party might tell you is like, well, boy, here's the Keene office, we'll see you over there. But like it was relatively straightforward. I also think part of it is back then New Hampshire was a swing state, and no one in DC thinks New Hampshire is a swing state anymore, which we can get to later. But it has become so much more decentralized, and COVID was a real accelerant to that. I think there's a lot of pros. Like it's great. I do think we get more people involved on net by, there's just so many, like Emily was saying, so many ways to find like a postcard project. Or I was talking to someone who was like, oh, I've been doing calls into Georgia with some law firm to tell people that they are like statistically likely to mess up the signature on the ballot or whatever. Like, like all kinds of sort of obscure things you can do, which are great and they're all worth doing. But I think all those like little points of light, of blue light in Windham County are being like fractured in more ways than they used to,
And
which
I
is just
think
different.
I think that's amazing because it is more people doing
Yeah,
more to feel connected nationally to what's happening. But sort of along with the COVID scheme, people aren't building community amongst themselves in doing that for the most part. I mean, Sister District, I think, is a standout exception because it's a group of
yes.
people, mostly
Mhm.
women, who do this project together for another state. But most people writing postcards alone at home or curing ballots alone at home or whatever it is are
And
doing this in isolation with their family, and they're not finding other people to be doing it
yes.
with in our county to feel that community. And that I think is a huge loss.
And I'd say the
Hmm.
biggest loss that I see the most in Windham County is, I don't know if you can swear on this podcast, but just had to bite my, okay. No one wants to talk to someone who's not a Democrat anymore. Like
Hmm.
getting people to the extent they want to write their postcards, or maybe if they want to make phone calls, well, they want to like extract the guarantee that I'm only going to put them on the phone with a nice, charming young man in Georgia who's a Democrat, and we'll have a great conversation with them for 30 minutes, and then they can go home. Like people are not it's funny because I think most Democrats around here, like if they got a call from the Trump campaign, they might have a hard time not saying a foul word to them about Trump and MAGA and all that and leave me alone. And then if they call someone, in Pennsylvania and they happen to get a Trumper on the phone, that'll like, shake them for the rest of the day. I get it. They're not like fun conversations, but I think that in terms of like volunteer psychology, I think the like increasing polarization and distance post COVID has made it so much harder to get folks to have difficult conversations who do not see the world the same way that we do.
And
Um,
I think that's particularly interesting in Vermont. And I had regularly when I am knocking on doors, someone will say, "Well, I'm a registered independent," or "I'm a registered." And I'm like, "You're in fact not, because we do
yes.
not have one, we don't have register party registration here, and two, an independent means you're not party affiliated, so you wouldn't even register for that. Like, what
Mhm.
is happening in this conversation? It's very confusing to me." Um, and so people like are sort of like digging in on their party affiliation in a state that's like both structurally has no party affiliation. As Lachlan said, it's like three people who feel like a Democrat that morning, maybe, or are willing to say that they feel like a Democrat. And two, like Vermont's famous for like people crossing, like mixed ballots, right? Like
Yep.
people don't vote party affiliation in Vermont. And so we have an opportunity here for people to like build community through volunteerism, actually find opportunities to have tough conversations with their neighbors.
Yeah.
And yet, because like I think people have this perception of Windham County as this sort of like safe blue place. People don't bother. But it seems
Mhm.
like it's even more important a thing to do here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like it's a real, like Emily's absolutely right. There's no state that has a higher percentage of the population who's going to walk into the voting booth and split their ticket. Like it'll be very close. It'll be between a plurality and a majority, but like between about 45 and 53% of Vermonters are going to walk into the voting booth and vote for Kamala Harris and Phil Scott. That does not happen anywhere else. That is by far the most common and most typical voter behavior in Vermont, and it has been in 2020 and 2022, and it will be again this year. Um, and that makes Vermont voters very interesting and very unusual. Um, but it's you'd think that like the fact that there is so much difference maybe could make people more interested to have those conversations, but I don't think that's always the case.
Mhm.
And I think that's really, Vermont's story about itself as like a place that leads the nation in volunteerism and civility and small town and all of that. Like we could be doing the work or, putting in the time to actually sort of show what it's like to rebuild some of those ties that bind across party affiliation, across political perspective in our communities. And yet, because we're doing things in such isolation from each other, I think it becomes harder and harder to do so. And people are less and less willing to. And when I very stubbornly knock on all the doors, not just the likely Democratic voter doors. Um, Because again, I just feel like I need to represent everyone, so I should talk to everyone. I'm not trying to persuade people really. But a lot of people who are not planning on voting for me just wouldn't talk to me,
Hmm.
which I found sort of like, like you can yell at me. That's okay. Like, let's do it. Like, that's what we're here for. Like, what, like I'm still going to be going up there, like, tell me what you think. Um, and for the most part, people don't want to do that, which I guess, like, on some level is just like, New England good manners. Um, but it's interesting, I remember my first race, there was someone they opened the door and they just like lit into me. And I just sort of like looked at them and listened for a while. Um, and like 2 years later, they emailed me and they're like, I don't know if you remember me, but I like really just tried to destroy you verbally. And you stayed there and listened. And I like, you have my respect and my vote forever. And I was like, I don't understand your brain, buddy, but thank you. Like,
Yeah. So many people just want to be listened to
yeah.
Mhm.
above all else, especially in a place like Windham County where they know their vote doesn't matter. Like, sorry, like in most districts, or like when you first ran, Emily, you had a competitive primary, but like especially in a general election, most people know that their vote has no impact on the direction of the state. And it's different, like for a select board or whatever. But like,
Mm.
yeah, if you're living in the Putney-Dummerston district and you're not a Democrat, sorry, your vote ain't going to matter at all. Um, but you still have your opportunity to be listened to. That's all you got,
Mhm.
and people do, and that really like it cuts both ways. I mean, I remember in 2014, certainly controversial figure. Like plenty of people didn't like him, but when I was hired by the party to be an organizer in Windham County and do get out the vote for like last few weeks of the campaign. That might have been the last time there was a full-time staffer assigned to Windham County from the state party. Um, but yeah, it was 10 years ago. And, they sent me down here and they're like, all right, here's a list of like 500 people or whatever who might volunteer. Start calling them. And guy calls me and left a voicemail. Guy calls me back and he's like, is it true that like and to Emily's point earlier about like people only want to do things where they think something could go wrong. He's like, is it really true that like Shumlin could lose? Like there's actually an election in Vermont this year. Like, oh, we're taking it seriously. Anything could happen. Please come volunteer. We need you. And he's like, okay, okay, I'll come, but I'm only coming because in 1996, Peter cross country skied up my driveway to ask for my vote. And that's like it was 2014, so 18 years later. And that was like he was like, I'll come. But that I just want you to know the only two reasons are because I didn't think he was gonna lose, and now you're telling me maybe it's a real election, and two, because he skied up to my house. And that's like that kind of stuff totally sticks with people. The skiing thing's extreme, but just standing there and being yelled at or like whatever those things are, it goes a long way in Vermont because yeah, people want to be heard and they know that your vote isn't always the way to do it in Vermont. And I would say actually in a lot of ways, like, I had Tim Kipp at the high school who always used to say your commitment to democracy starts at the ballot box. It doesn't end there. And
Mhm.
in Vermont, there's nowhere that's more true. Like I met, by like years ago now, met every living governor in Vermont, and like two of them I met at a grocery store. So, like it's just we're a funny state like that. Like you can meet people, bump into them, get your ideas heard and shared pretty easily, which is charming in a lot of ways.
Well, and I guess too that going back to meeting a governor in a grocery store or Shumlin skiing up someone's driveway, there's an expectation of a personal connection
Yeah,
to the candidates and therefore a personal connection to whatever is happening at the policy level. Um, and maybe that's, like you said, if quote unquote votes don't count, which having covered several elections where things flipped by one vote, I always think you should show up at the ballot box because you never know. Um, but yeah, there are other ways to influence policy besides just voting.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that people still sort of like perceive the party machine, which again, not a machine, as like just about tallying the votes and getting the votes, when in fact it's actually like a fairly straightforward mechanism to be meeting your elected officials and the candidates face to face to be able to have those conversations. So you don't have to like interrupt people while they're looking for jam, right? And so that's also a funny part about it. Like people sort of assume that politics isn't about like politics with a capital P isn't about people. And so they write off this whole sort of system and infrastructure, kind of infrastructure, when that actually might be the most straightforward way that they could be connecting with folks who are actually going to make a difference in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would argue too that when if you are someone who goes to the different parties' website and checks platforms, it's a really great place to start with, okay, so your party has this platform. Where do you,
Mhm.
candidate, stand on that platform?
Oh,
Like it gives you a starting point with all this very dense policy that's out there. It gives you a starting point for asking questions.
except I should make sure that I name, and I meant to at the beginning when we were talking about sort of the party machine and its relationship to the politicians, that neither the House nor the Senate Democratic caucus really pays any attention to the platform at all.
Yeah.
But see, that's a good place to start. Still a good place to start questions.
Yes, yes. It's very interesting. They really operate in like complete parallel from each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And I honestly, I wrestle with whether or not we should even have one.
Oh, really?
I'd really rather just have like a mission and a value statement and not like if we can't tell people why we're Democrats in one page, why do we exist? We don't need 90 something pages.
It's 90 something pages.
It's absurd. It's absurd. It's because they
Wow.
just like, oh, we love this too. I know, no kidding, no kidding. We love a lot of things. Like, let's can we make it a little more concise? Because right, if it's so dense, our own legislators don't even read it. Good luck getting like a swing voter to read it. Um, so yes, that's my own personal 2 cents on it. But I think like, you know, it's about mission and values. Because also, right, to Emily's point, like we can't possibly do all the things in it at any
Hmm.
given time. And I wouldn't want to like give people the false impression that like, yes, we are committed to enacting these 600 things or whatever, in the next 12 months or like it's is a gradual document.
Hmm. Hmm. We're just about out of time. So Emily and Lachlan, what do you want to leave listeners with?
Well, you go first.
I want to just sort of like come back to this very sort of basic theory that like politics is people and government is people, and all of those are available to people who are interested in other people and their own lives. And so if anyone wants to talk to me about any of that, they can find me at emilykornheiser.org, links to the phone number, website, etc. Um, and, there's so many just sort of different ways to show up and dig in and talk to people about what you care about.
Lachlan.
Yeah, I would really echo that. Like I would say I think especially as Vermont Democrats for all the reasons that we've talked about, like, I do think there's in the scheme of things, a pretty broad tent like in our local Democratic Party in terms of where people fall. Like I think um we've got some like core values. Obviously, you see those in the starkest relief in the presidential race. But there's a lot of people from all different parts of the county and of different persuasions or proclivities who are part of the committee. And it's like really at the end of the day, if you want to get involved and yeah, make your voice heard and have some access and some. I don't mean power like political power, but like power in terms of like contributing to what's going on. It's a great way to get involved and we appreciate the folks who are and are always welcoming more. Emily, should we plug the election night thing? I don't know.
Oh, yeah. So we're
Yes.
having a party on election
Woo!
at the Stone Church. Special guest, Congresswoman Becca Ballant. There will be live music, there will be food, there will be dancing, there will be a minimum of speeches that are sprinkled throughout the night, so you will never be trapped standing anywhere having to listen to multiple speeches, because I cannot. And
Yeah, we're an anti-speech party. I can't believe we made it to minute 63 before we mentioned that, Emily.
but I think just Lachlan and I are anti-speech. I don't think we're an anti-speech party. I think it's just Lachlan and And so would love for any and all folks to join us and register in advance. It's totally free to attend, but would really appreciate folks registering in advance. You can do that on my social media, at the Stone Church's social media, or getting in touch with Lachlan at the Windham Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And Lachlan, if people are interested in becoming involved with the Windham Democratic Party, how do they do that?
So we've got a few events, like get out the vote events and whatnot, mostly focused on New Hampshire, not Vermont at this point in the election. But the best way to access those is to go to mobilize.us. You can put in your zip code. It'll pull up all the volunteer events coming up in your vicinity. The election night party, for example, is on there as well. So you can sign up for one of those. We'd love to have you. Otherwise, Windham County Democrats VT at gmail.com is our email. That's also on our website, which I think is the same domain as that.com. And yeah, happy to have folks get involved or plug in, however is most helpful for them.
Fantastic. Well, Lachlan Francis, Emily Kornheiser, thank you for being with us today. And of course, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2. Rebroadcasted on Wednesday mornings, as well as wherever you subscribe to your podcasts, and of course on BCTV. Take care, everyone. Have a good weekend.